Okay. Only one of the presentation will be recorded for educational purposes, and there will be Q&A, and you can put your question in the chat box. And I'm also the presenter will introduce themselves in more detail when they get at the podium. Okay. Any question, please let me know. And welcome. And welcome, Jessica from your college, CUNY.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that. All right, I'm just going to share my screen and then pull up my presentation. And just, a reminder that it's being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, turn off your video. Yeah, thank you for joining me today for my presentations. I really appreciate it. So just pull this up here. Okay, so you should see screen, and I'm just going to go into presentation mode. Okay, great. So can somebody just unmute themselves and let me know if they can see my title slide?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, and then I do not have my, okay, so we're gonna go from now. If somebody can just give me a warning. I have this time, but when I'm getting close, if someone just let me know. I don't have my watch on me, so thank you. So thank you so much for joining me for my presentation today. My name is today we'll be discussing problematic behavior in public libraries and whether library rules and policies are keeping staff and patrons who use libraries safe. So my name is Jessica Jackson. I'm an assistant professor at York College. I do outreach and assessment here. And I started this role in the fall of 2003. Before starting, I worked at public libraries in Edmonton, Alberta, which is in Canada, from 2011 to 2016. I was a paraprofessional there, what we call a library assistant, and I worked for the New York Public Library from 2016 to 2023 as both a children's librarian and adult librarian. And very briefly, I worked over the summer of 2003. I worked at the Brooklyn Public Library as a business librarian. So lots of different roles within public libraries and at different public library systems in urban areas and cities. So before I begin, here is an overview of what I will be discussing today. I will start by discussing previous research on this topic and explain what exactly I considered when I did a close reading of library rules and policies at different urban libraries in the United States. I didn't look at Canada or other countries, even though I am Canadian. I will then share some examples that I think effectively highlight the range of diversity within these policies, including aspects that I find particularly noteworthy and effective. So let's start with previous research. So there's actually not a lot of previous research that examines the rules or policies at public libraries. There is a relatively recent article called Rules for Readers, U.S. Public Libraries in Search of the Golden Mean. And it was published in a journal. I apologize to any Russian speaker out there if I say this incorrectly, but it was published in a journal called Bibliotekovedenie. And it was published in Russian, and only the abstract is available in English. So I don't think it was really widely read, unfortunately, in North America. So there's also a very practical book entitled "It Comes with the Territory: Handling Problem Situations in Libraries." It was published in 1993, so it's not exactly current anymore. And then finally, the American Library Association has recommendations called Guidelines for the Development of Policies and Procedures Regarding User Behavior and Library Usage. And these guidelines were included in the appendices of the book that I mentioned. Excuse me. And they were initially adopted by the ALA Intellectual Freedom Committee on January 24th, 1993. And they've been revised several times over the years, most recently in August of 2020. However, from what I can tell, there hasn't been any research as to whether public libraries are following like these guidelines. So like when they create, their public library policies, are they actually like, following the guidelines that the ALA has developed over the years. It's also worth considering whether or not these guidelines should be reconsidered and reconsidered and updated, since it's been 4 years. So when I did a close read of the rules and policies at the different public libraries, I considered whether it included several key characteristics. And these characteristics are based on the aforementioned ALA guidelines and my own personal experience as a librarian. So some of what I considered include, like, what are these rules called, right? Are they rules? Are they policies? Are they code of conduct? What are we calling them? Do the rules state the purpose or the intended uses of the library? Do the policies state how staff can support the policy, like what staff are empowered to do? And are the rules prescriptive, descriptive, or a combination? And how detailed are the rule? Like, do they give, are they more general or are they more specific? Are violations classified into different tiers or types? Are there clearly stated outcomes for violating the policy? Are there dates for when the policy was updated and who's responsible for creating it? And then what language is used to describe the outcome where a person's no longer permitted to enter the library? And does the policy mention a commitment to intellectual freedom? So before I begin going into all of the different examples, I would like to point out that in addition to kind of general rules or code of conduct, most public libraries have additional policies covering things like computer usage and program attendance and things of that nature. And I will not be considering these policies today, but I think that that's certainly something for future research. All of the policies that I examined today will be looking at 3 different library systems: the New York Public Library, Brooklyn Public Library, and Seattle Public Library. But I looked at a lot more, but just in the interest of time, obviously. They're available online on the library's respective websites. However, I'm also interested in how clearly these policies are posted in public libraries in the physical public spaces themselves, because that's obviously important. So that could be something else to consider for future research. And so for each of the libraries that I'll be discussing today, I won't have time to go into in detail of every single one of these aspects, but as I mentioned, I will kind of be highlighting different aspects that I think are particularly noteworthy about that. So start with the New York Public Library. So obviously an institution that I worked at for many, many years. So it's the largest public library in the United States. They have 92 locations, including 88 branches of varying sizes, some of them which are quite small. And then of course they have their 4 wonderful research libraries. They call their document just the general rules and policies. And they state that the reason for the policy is to maintain a safe and welcoming environment for reading, learning, and other library activities. So note that while NYPL does use the word safety when it describes the intended uses of the library, so the intended uses are reading, learning, other library activities. So it's pretty general. So they use the word safety, but there's no specific mention of the safety of staff or patrons. It's just kind of about, say, maintaining a safe and welcoming environment. So that's something that initially really stood out to me. So library staff may inspect any property of a patron who enters or leaves the library, or ask patrons to show their library card or other ID. Note that compared to a couple of other policies that we'll be examining later, there is no mention that authorized staff members may ask a patron to leave the library, which I can say from experience can make dealing with problematic behavior challenging for library staff. And the language that NYPL uses for to describe patrons who are no longer permitted to be in the library is barred. So they would use they use the term that somebody is barred from the library. So overall, the language that NYPL uses in their rules and policies, it's largely descriptive, but not very detailed. So it consists of 20 numbered behaviors, which are not permitted. And these behaviors are not further broken down into categories or anything like that. So one thing that's worth noting, and this is not the only, not picking an NYPL for this, but for other ones, there's for the other libraries that I'll be discussing, there's more noteworthy things that I think is worth mentioning, is you'll notice that this was last revised in December of 2019, which is actually before the ALA most recently updated their guidelines for policies. So, that doesn't necessarily mean that NYPL haven't reviewed this document, of course. Maybe they reviewed it and, decided, no, this still meets the current, kind of recommendations and we don't need to change it. But it doesn't necessarily indicate that they have, which, might be something that they would, want to consider. So Brooklyn Public Library. So another library which serves the 5 boroughs. So, but just one of them, just Brooklyn. For those of you who are from outside New York City today, I really shouldn't assume that everyone here is from the New York metro area. But for those of you who are attending that are not from the New York metro area, the 5 boroughs are actually served by 3 different library systems. So the Brooklyn Public Library, which exclusively serves the borough of Brooklyn, the Queens Public Library, which exclusively serves the borough of Queens, and then the New York Public Library, which serves the Bronx, Manhattan, and Staten Island. And the reason for that is when the New York Public Library was founded in 1896, Brooklyn and Queens are actually separate cities. And so it wasn't the 5 boroughs as we know it today. So just a little bit of New York Public Library history there. So Brooklyn Public Library, so they have 63 locations. So they have one large central library location, and then 62 locations of different sizes. And they call their kind of main document about kind of library policy behavior, public behavior in the library policy. And they're very, very clear that the reason for the policy is intended to, protect the safety of library users and protect the safety of staff members. So they're very, very clear on that. What I think is interesting in this case is BPL's policy is almost the inverse of NYPL's, in that they clearly state that the rules are for patron and staff safety. However, they actually don't describe the intended uses of the library in their policy, which is kind of interesting. So one thing that I wanted to point out is, library staff may take any and all appropriate action, including but not limited to asking a library user to leave the premises with or without prior warning, depending on the seriousness of the violation. So that's very, very different, from NYPL, that it's very, very clearly stated that a staff member can, ask someone to, leave the library for the day. And they use so it significantly empowers library staff to address problematic behavior compared to NYPL's. And they use the term excluded or exclude to describe when patrons are no longer permitted to be in the library for a period of time. So BPL's policy is also largely descriptive. So it consists of bulleted as opposed to numbered rules of conduct, with violations classified into tiers or types. And so they call those tiers illegal activities, harmful, disruptive, or destructive behavior, and other inappropriate behavior. So this is really important and worth noting, because one of the recommendations of the ALA's guidelines is that, libraries not only follow the guidelines when crafting their own policies, but that libraries regularly have training, for staff members, so that they can, feel comfortable enforcing the rules as needed. And I think this particular one is important to know from a management and staff training perspective, because since the policy states that staff may ask patrons to leave the premises without prior warning, depending on the seriousness of the violation, it's important that staff have a good understanding of what that means. Because, the policy is, also states that, up to including calling the police, which is quite serious. Right. So, we want staff to feel empowered so that they understand, or want staff to feel empowered so that they can look after their own safety and the safety of other patrons. But we also don't want them misusing that power so that they're, calling the police for things that might not necessarily be appropriate for and might actually be harmful for. So I think that is worth noting, that if you're going to include this in your policy, that it's important that staff understand, well, where, and I think that's why Brooklyn Public Library actually includes different tiers, is that, for a particular tier, you might ask a patron, you just need to leave the library for the day, you can come back for tomorrow. Whereas, what would be another tier where you might actually, for some reason need to call the police. So it's really important that staff have that understanding. And then also similar to MYPL, this version that's available on the website is not been changed for some time, and so doesn't necessarily mean that it hasn't been looked at, but is worth noting. So the other library that I would like to talk about today is Seattle Public Library. And the Seattle Public Library, significantly smaller than either New York or even the Brooklyn Public Library. They call their, the document that I looked at, they call the Rules of Conduct. And it states that, that it's very, its reason for the policy, or the preamble, is fairly unique, in that they not only state the intended purposes of the library, but it's much more detailed than NYPL's, for example. So NYPL just kind of listed, reading, studying, other library activities, whereas Seattle, kind of talks about it's a clean, comfortable, safe place for selecting materials, reading, researching, studying, writing, and attending programs and meetings. So it's a little bit kind of broader as to what the library services that the library offers and services that the library does. But it is unique in that it explicitly states how the library is financed, which is the taxes of the people of Seattle, and that there are certain expectations that come along with that. And then they also state that the rules are established to protect the rights and safety of patrons, volunteers, and staff. The other thing that I wanted to point out about this one, which is why I chose to focus on it as the third one, is within that preamble, it also states that the library has a strong commitment to intellectual freedom and access to information. And, from my perspective, having worked as a public librarian, a frontline staff member, this is extremely helpful to have this in your, your library policy, especially in the current climate where there's increasing attempts at censorship and book banning, just, to have that there when, interacting with patrons. So library staff may intervene to stop prohibited activities and behaviors. It doesn't really detail the types of intervention that staff can do in the way that Brooklyn Public Libraries does. And they refer to their outcomes as when a patron is no longer permitted to enter the library, they call that exclusion. Okay, so patrons receive a notice of exclusion, and it's also more detailed as to when that is. So Brooklyn Public Libraries and NYPLs, they state that somebody could be, no longer permitted to enter the library, but doesn't state what the particular period is. Where Seattle's very clear, it can be a day up to 2 years, depending on, I guess, the seriousness of the transgression. So Seattle Public Libraries rules are very, very, very descriptive, and they're particularly detailed. And they're also bulleted, as opposed to numbered. And by highly detailed, I mean, and I'm going to use this particular example. So for example, rather than saying sleeping is not permitted in the library or no sleeping, it states lying down or appearing to be sleeping is not permitted in the library. And when I read this, I really loved that line, because I can tell you that that line is the contribution of somebody who has worked in a public library. And if you have ever worked in a public library, you will probably have had the experience of needing to speak to a patron about sleeping, where you approach them, and you ask, like, in a voice that's not going to frighten them when they wake, are you feeling okay? To check to make sure that they're, that they're not, unwell. So you ask them if they're okay, and then once you confirm that, you inform them that sleeping is not permitted in the library. And, I've experienced this number of times where there's this pause, and the patron, will reply without opening their eyes, and they'll say, "I'm not sleeping. I'm just resting my eyes." And I experienced this situation very early on in my library career, my work as a public librarian. And I hope what it illustrates is that people who use public spaces often know and understand the rules as well, or sometimes better than library staff do. And it caused me to realize that knowing and understanding library rules it's not just pedantic, but it is a way that we help avoid conflict. So for those of us who live in New York City, we know that New Yorkers, we really know how to push the limits. We will push it to the utmost. And this is very much true of users in public libraries. So Seattle Public Library also classifies different library violations into tiers, which they call categories A through E. And there are library-specific violations, serious library-specific violations, drug or alcohol or possession use, violation towards person or property, and serious violations towards person or property. So the last thing, sorry, one more thing before I change slides that I wanted to mention is one of the things that I really wanted to highlight about this is one of the reasons why I think that the Seattle's public library policy is so detailed is you can really see that they have spent a lot of time working on this. As you can see, they indicate the number of revisions, and it has been revised frequently over the years. And I think that the fact that they have this long history of refining and updating this policy is they've clearly put a lot of thought into it. And I think that the Seattle Public Library should be commended for that. Okay, so wrapping up. So why are library rules and policies so important? So, like how, kind of how is this helpful? So for me, a library's rules is, it's not just that I like rules, but a library's rules are essentially a library's vision for how that space will be utilized and what people will experience and how people will be treated in that space. And when you don't have a clear policy that states, kind of what is permitted and not permitted, and how staff are empowered to, to ensure that environment is maintained. When you don't have that, I think it shows a lack of understanding on administration, and a lack of concern for the day-to-day realities of what frontline librarians are experiencing. And so, public libraries, they're open to everyone, and we want them to be. But that means that librarians often encounter a range of problematic behaviors that put them and other patrons at risk of harm. And, in my, time working in a public library, you experience a lot. Thank you. So I really think it's important when you are, I really liked the kind of the title of the LACUNY Institute this year, that moving beyond the challenged librarian. And I think there is now more than ever an acknowledgement of the realities of public the work of public service librarians, and how challenging and how difficult that is. And, many public librarians experiencing, for example, like trauma and traumatic things that happen to them over the course of their work as a librarian. And I can certainly speak to that myself and for my colleagues. And so I think it's really important to be candid about the challenges that public librarians face with respect to patron behavior. Libraries are socially complicated spaces, and I think that it's important to recognize that, because that that's how we can ultimately make libraries better and allow libraries to serve the public in a way that's more effective. And, part of the reason why I wanted to focus on this is, since starting at CUNY, I have a lot of different research areas that I'm interested in, research related to assessment and early literacy based on my experiences doing working as a children's librarian. But I really wanted to do a little bit of research, or to kind of start by doing some research in public libraries, because I just thought it was a good way to kind of acknowledge the years that I spent working as a public librarian, and all the incredible, wonderful public service librarians across Canada and the US that do tremendous work. And I really think that it's important that we are ensuring that libraries where people work have policies that are keeping people safe, and that staff members and patrons safe, and that they're written in the best possible way according to the most current ALA guidelines. So what are some recommendations so that we can move beyond just being constantly challenged librarians and be more effective at our work, and ensure that that libraries are functioning well, and that library workers are having good experiences in their day-to-day jobs? So I think, as I mentioned, is just acknowledging that libraries are socially complicated spaces. I think that is really important, and I think that just within the past few years, and I think that I think the pandemic has been part of that, is that people, at all levels, to the highest level, are within the library community, are starting to recognize the challenge. Thank you. Starting to recognize the challenges of frontline public librarianship, and I think that is really important. And so I would also, based on the and I looked at other libraries as well, besides the three that I mentioned, but I think that including the intended purposes of a public library in the preamble is important. And then clearly state that the reason for the policies is to ensure the safety of library staff and users. That would be my next recommendation. And then to make the policy both prescriptive and descriptive. So the fourth library that I really wanted to talk about, but I knew I wouldn't have the time, is Los Angeles Public Library. And I would really encourage everyone to look at it, because there's, and it feels very California the way they did it, but the Los Angeles Public Library they have things kind of in a more positive way. So for example, during your time in the library, please be respectful and considerate of others. Accompany and take responsibility for those in your care. So they kind of talk about things that you should do rather than they also talk about things that you should not do, but things that you should do. And then finally, in the current climate, really important, include a commitment to intellectual freedom. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you for coming to my presentation. I look forward to your questions. And if you are a fellow, former public library worker or current public library worker in an urban public library or suburban or rural, I don't care. If you work in a public library and would like to discuss your experiences, I would love to hear from you. So please reach out so that we can connect. And thank you so much. And I'm going to stop sharing now.